A racist neighbor picks up the phone and calls the police on a black family, accusing them of being suspicious. He has no real reason, no valid complaint, just a deep-seated bias against them. The police arrive, and the tension in the air is palpable. The black family is confused and frustrated, standing there, unsure of what they've done to deserve this treatment. But things are about to take an unexpected turn. As the officer starts to question them, the air shifts. The officer, who initially seems skeptical, suddenly changes his tone, his demeanor shifting in a way that surprises everyone. What happens next is something nobody could have seen coming. The neighbor watches, expecting the family to be punished, but what unfolds in front of him will change everything. The power dynamic he relied on is about to crumble. The family is about to turn the tables, and what happens next will leave the neighbor and everyone watching speechless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The neighbor's call to the police has sparked a tension-filled moment. The officer, who steps onto the property, looks at the black family standing outside their home, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The neighbor, still standing across the street, gestures in their direction, accusing them of causing trouble for no reason. The officer pauses and takes a step closer to the family, but instead of confronting them with anger or suspicion, he begins asking simple questions. The family, confused yet composed, responds politely. They haven't been doing anything wrong, just enjoying a quiet day at home. With each passing moment, the situation feels more surreal. The neighbor, who seems convinced that his biased judgment is right, watches from afar, waiting for the officer to take action. However, the officer's demeanor starts to shift as he listens to the family's calm responses. Slowly, the officer begins to realize that there was no real reason to have come out here in the first place. The family has done nothing to deserve this treatment, and they aren't the ones causing trouble. Then, in a turn that shocks everyone, the officer turns away from the family and walks towards the neighbor. The neighbor's face freezes in disbelief. He expected the officer to question or arrest the family, not confront him. The officer walks straight up to him, his voice steady and clear. "This is your last warning. If you continue to make false accusations against these people, I'll have to take further action." The neighbor is stunned. His bias has just backfired in a way he never expected. The officer leaves without arresting anyone, instead sending a firm message that racism and unjust accusations won't be tolerated. The family, relieved but empowered, watches as the officer leaves the scene, the neighbor silenced. What started as a racially charged situation has ended with the neighbor learning a hard lesson. The neighbor, standing across the street with a phone pressed to his ear, continues to watch the black family, his suspicion growing with every passing second. His eyes narrow, convinced that something is wrong, even though there's no evidence to suggest it. He makes the call, reporting them to the police for a supposed disturbance. Seconds later, the police arrive, and the tension in the air becomes thick. The officer steps out of his car, his gaze scanning the family in front of their home, who are simply standing on their porch, chatting and enjoying the fresh air. The officer approaches with caution, sensing the unease, but not quite sure what he's walking into. The neighbor is still watching, arms folded, his expression full of judgment. Without waiting for the officer to speak, he starts pointing in the family's direction, speaking in a hurried tone. "They've been causing trouble. I don't know what they're up to, but it doesn't look right." The officer looks between the neighbor and the family. He doesn't see trouble. Instead, he sees a family that's calm and peaceful. The family exchanges confused glances, realizing that they're being targeted based on nothing more than the color of their skin. The officer's eyes soften as he looks at the family, and he decides to speak with them directly. "Is everything okay here?" he asks, his voice calm but searching for answers. The family, still bewildered, assures him that there's no problem at all. The officer listens to their side of the story and starts to piece together the situation. He knows something doesn't add up. He looks back at the neighbor who stands there with a smug look, still convinced he's in the right. Without hesitation, the officer turns to him. "I've spoken to them," he says firmly. "There's no issue here. It's clear you've made a false report." The neighbor's face turns pale, the smugness quickly fading as the officer's words settle in. The officer steps forward, his presence firm and unwavering. "Next time you make a call like this, make sure you have solid reasons. This could have serious consequences." The neighbor stammers, trying to protest, but the officer's patience is thin. "You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't. We all have the right to live peacefully." He pauses, looking directly at the family with a nod, before he directs his attention back to the neighbor. The neighbor, humiliated and exposed, is left standing in silence as the officer turns away. He walks back to his car, and the family, though shaken, feels a sense of relief. The officer doesn't arrest anyone, but he has made it clear that the neighbor's prejudiced actions won't be tolerated. As the officer drives away, the family shares a quiet moment, grateful for the officer's understanding and support. The neighbor, on the other hand, is left to reflect on his actions as the reality of the situation sets in. His biased judgment has not only failed to cause harm to the family, but it has now backfired on him in a way he'll never forget. The neighbor stands on his porch, his eyes narrowed, suspiciously watching the black family across the street. The family is just minding their own business, chatting and laughing together, a picture of peace. But to this neighbor, something about them doesn't sit right. His discomfort deepens, and soon his hand is reaching for his phone. Without thinking twice, he dials 911, reporting the family as a disturbance. He stands there, watching them from the shadows, feeling sure he's in the right, convinced that something about them doesn't belong. As the phone call ends, he watches as the police car pulls up in front of their house, lights flashing and sirens blaring. It's as if everything in the neighborhood has come to a halt. The officer steps out of his vehicle, looking around at the family with an inquisitive gaze. The officer scans the group, confused by what he's seeing. The family appears perfectly calm, their smiles lighting up their faces, clearly enjoying a peaceful afternoon. The officer is unsure what to expect. Without any hesitation, the officer approaches them and asks, "Is everything all right here?" The question seems almost absurd because they're doing nothing wrong, but they respond calmly, telling him they're fine. Still, the officer has to ask a few more questions, feeling the need to get to the bottom of why he's been called out here in the first place. The family stands firm, explaining to the officer that there's been a misunderstanding. They're not causing any trouble. They're simply living their lives. One of them even points across the street, where the neighbor is still standing, watching from a distance with his arms crossed. It's obvious now that the issue lies with him, and the family can feel the weight of the suspicion hanging in the air. The officer looks at the family, then back at the neighbor, who is still watching from afar. It's clear that the situation is about to change. The officer knows that something doesn't add up. He looks at the family one last time, their expressions calm but clearly uncomfortable, and turns to the neighbor. Without warning, he walks over to the neighbor, his posture rigid and firm. The neighbor, who thought his call was going unnoticed, watches as the officer approaches. He straightens up, expecting a compliment for being diligent in calling the police. But the officer doesn't acknowledge him with any kind of pleasantries. Instead, the officer looks him square in the eyes and says, "I've spoken to them. There's no issue here. In fact, you made a false report." The words hit the neighbor like a ton of bricks. His face pales as he stammers, trying to defend his actions. But they're just standing there, doing something suspicious, he protests weakly, though he knows deep down that his claim has no real basis. The officer stands his ground, not backing down an inch. It's not up to you to decide who belongs and who doesn't. We all have the right to live peacefully. You've made an accusation without cause, and now you need to understand that it has consequences. The neighbor's eyes widen with disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as he tries to come up with something to say. But nothing comes out. He's been caught, and there's no escaping it. The officer's tone grows more serious as he speaks again. If you continue to make baseless claims like this, it won't go unnoticed. You can't make people feel like they don't belong because of the color of their skin. The neighbor is left standing there, humiliated and stunned. He watches as the officer turns his back, walking back to his patrol car, his mind racing with the realization that he's lost. The officer drives away, leaving the neighbor to face the full weight of his actions. The family, though shaken, feels a sense of relief wash over them. They don't have to endure the judgment of someone who's made a mistake based on nothing but prejudice. They exchange a few quiet words of thanks to each other, knowing that their rights have been protected by the officer who saw through the baseless complaint. As the neighbor watches the family return to their peaceful existence, he's forced to confront the ugliness of his own biases. He realizes that his attempt to control the situation and force others into his narrow view of the world has failed. And while the family is left with a renewed sense of strength, the neighbor is left with only the weight of his actions and the lesson that you can't judge others based on assumptions. The phone rings in the neighbor's house, his hand trembling slightly as he dials the police. He's convinced that something isn't right, that the black family next door is doing something wrong. As his finger presses the last digit, a sense of unease settles over him. The line clicks, and the 911 operator answers. "I think there's trouble," he says, his voice filled with suspicion. "There's a black family next door, and they're acting suspiciously. I'm not sure what they're doing, but it feels off." The operator listens, then asks, "Can you explain what's happening?" The neighbor mumbles an incoherent response, unsure of exactly what to say. "They're just outside, standing around, talking. It's weird." The operator sighs, clearly frustrated. "We need specifics. What's the problem? What exactly is happening?" But the neighbor can't provide any real answer. Still, he presses on, describing the family as if their mere presence is a problem, his words steeped in prejudice. Minutes later, the sirens wail as a police car pulls up outside the family's home. The flashing lights bounce off the walls, signaling the arrival of the officer who's been called to investigate the disturbance. The family is in their front yard, enjoying a beautiful afternoon. They're having a family gathering, laughing and talking, their children playing nearby. But as the officer steps out of the car and approaches, there's an uneasy shift in the atmosphere. The officer scans the family, noting their calm demeanor, the smiles on their faces, the peacefulness of the situation. He wonders what could have prompted such a call. It doesn't add up. He clears his throat before approaching them. "Is everything all right here?" he asks. The family, confused, looks at each other. They haven't done anything wrong. They're simply enjoying their day, like any family would. One of them, the father, steps forward and speaks up, explaining that there's been a misunderstanding, that they're simply enjoying the day. The officer listens carefully, his expression serious but not confrontational. He asks if there's a reason the neighbor might have thought there was an issue. The family explains that they've had no interaction with the neighbor and are unaware of any reason why someone would call the police. The officer, still unsure, looks over toward the neighbor's house. From a distance, he sees the neighbor standing there, watching from his porch. It's clear now that the call came from him, but the officer doesn't jump to conclusions. Instead, he decides to investigate the situation thoroughly. He turns back to the family. "I'm just doing my job," the officer says. "But I have to ask, have you had any problems with your neighbor?" The family shakes their heads. "No, "We've never spoken to him. We don't know why he'd make such a call," the father replies. The officer stands there for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considers the situation. Something feels off, but he can't put his finger on it. Finally, he walks across the street toward the neighbor, who is still standing there, arms crossed. "Sir," the officer says as he approaches, his voice even, "I need to ask you what prompted the call. What exactly did you witness?" The neighbor, surprised by the officer's direct approach, starts to stutter. "I just thought something was wrong. They were acting strange. I mean, I just felt uncomfortable." The officer raises an eyebrow. "Uncomfortable? Did they do anything to make you feel that way?" The neighbor falters, realizing that his vague accusations won't hold up under scrutiny. "No, nothing really, just something about them. It didn't seem right." The officer remains silent for a moment before responding. "I think it's clear that there's been a misunderstanding. These people were doing nothing wrong." The officer's words are sharp and firm, and they hit the neighbor hard. He stands there stunned as the officer continues, "You're not allowed to make baseless accusations without cause. This could have escalated further, and you need to be more careful next time before you involve the police." The neighbor's face turns pale, realizing the gravity of his actions. The officer doesn't wait for him to respond, turning back and heading toward his car. The neighbor stands frozen, humiliated by the situation he's caused. Meanwhile, the family stands across the street, relieved but still uneasy. They've been subjected to an unnecessary and unjust call that they never asked for. They exchange glances, their hearts still racing, but grateful for the officer who saw through the baseless claim. As the officer drives away, the family begins to feel a sense of empowerment. They've been unjustly targeted, but they've also seen how quickly people can rally to their side. The neighborhood isn't always perfect, but in this moment, they were heard. The neighbor, meanwhile, feels the full weight of his actions. He watches as the officer leaves, and he knows he can never unsee the mistake he made today. The officer's words linger in his mind. "You need to be more careful." In the days that follow, the neighbor becomes a subject of gossip in the neighborhood, not for any good reason. People start to question his motives, and his reputation is tarnished. He's been caught in a lie, and now there's no escaping the consequences of his unfounded judgment. The family, though, finds peace once again. They continue living their lives undisturbed, knowing that the community sees them for who they truly are. Just another family, trying to live in peace, free from the bias that sometimes rears its ugly head. The tension builds as the phone call with the 911 operator concludes. The neighbor hangs up, convinced that something isn't right. His prejudiced suspicions clouding his judgment, he waits anxiously for the police to arrive, thinking that he's done his duty. He tells himself that the black family next door is doing something suspicious, but deep down, he can't quite articulate what that something is. Minutes pass, and the sound of sirens grows louder. The neighbor watches, nervous and eager, from behind his closed blinds as the police car rolls into the quiet street. It slows down and stops right in front of the black family's house. Inside, the family enjoys a sunny afternoon, unaware of the brewing storm. The children laugh and play in the yard, and the parents chat, basking in the warmth of the moment. They feel safe here, at home in their own neighborhood. But that feeling of comfort is about to be shattered. The doorbell rings, and the father opens it to see the officer standing there, his hand on his belt, looking at the family. He's polite, but carries a stern demeanor. "I need to ask some questions about an incident called in by your neighbor," the officer says. The father is immediately thrown off by the mention of the neighbor. He wonders if something's wrong with the neighbor's perception of them. "Is everything all right?" the father asks, unsure of what's happening. The officer hesitates for a moment before answering, There's been a call about suspicious behavior. Suspicion. The word stings. The family has done nothing wrong. They've been in their home, minding their business. But the mere color of their skin has raised a flag in the eyes of their neighbor. The officer asks for identification and begins his questioning. As he does, the father maintains his composure, answering politely and explaining that they've done nothing out of the ordinary. "We've lived here for years," he says calmly. "I don't understand why there's a problem now." The officer listens, his face blank. He clearly isn't sure what to make of the situation, but he's bound by the call. There's no reason for him to escalate things further, but the tension in the air is undeniable. The father stands there, bewildered and uncomfortable. Something feels wrong. As the officer continues to probe, the tension escalates. The family feels like they're being interrogated in their own home, simply because of the color of their skin. The mother steps forward, speaking up, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet power. "We haven't done anything wrong," she says, her eyes meeting the officer's. "What's really going on here?" The officer shifts on his feet, glancing back at the neighbor's house. The silence between them is palpable, but the officer is still holding on to the report, trying to piece together an explanation for the call. The mother remains firm in her stance. She insists that the officer explain the reasoning behind this situation. "You've been called out based on a suspicion that isn't even clear," she says. "We don't deserve this." The officer's eyes narrow slightly. He's clearly beginning to understand the problem. The call was made without a real basis. His presence here now seems unnecessary. He's caught between his duty to follow the report and the realization that the family has done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, the father keeps his composure, but a quiet fire of frustration starts to burn within him. Why should they be treated like this? Why should they face judgment based on nothing more than assumptions and bias? After what feels like an eternity, the officer takes a step back. He doesn't apologize, but he knows that his role in this interaction is over. With a nod, he gives the family a quick look of acknowledgement before turning to leave. "I'll let you go. Just make sure there's no trouble," he says. The family watches in silence as the officer walks away, not knowing what to make of the situation. But as the door closes behind them, there's a quiet realization. The injustice of the moment has not only unsettled them, but it has also fueled their resolve. They stand together, looking out the window toward the neighbor's house. They've been wronged, but they will not let that wrong define them. Instead of retreating into fear, they have found strength in each other and in their shared experience. The neighbor, meanwhile, is left alone in his house, facing the weight of his actions. His assumptions have been exposed. The officer's brief but firm interaction has made him question everything he thought he knew. His prejudices have come to light, and he can no longer hide behind them. In the days that follow, the neighbor's reputation begins to suffer. Word spreads that his call to the police was unjustified, and the community begins to question his character. The family, on the other hand, grows even more united, knowing that they stood their ground in the face of injustice. What began as a quiet afternoon in the neighborhood has turned into a powerful moment of reflection for everyone involved. The family will continue living their lives, but they've learned an important lesson. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means confronting the biases of others, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. A black family's peaceful afternoon is shattered when a neighbor calls the police, accusing them of suspicious activity. The family is left confused and uneasy as a police officer arrives at their home, demanding identification. The officer, unsure of the situation, doesn't seem to question why he was called. The father calmly explains that they haven't done anything wrong, but the officer, still unsure, asks for their ID. At this point, the mother steps in, demanding to know why they're being questioned. "We've done nothing wrong," she says, frustration building in her voice. "Why are we being treated like criminals?" As the officer stands silent, the neighbor appears at the door, muttering under his breath, "I knew something was off." The family realizes the officer's visit was based entirely on the neighbor's prejudices and assumptions. The father confronts the officer. "You've wasted our time over nothing." The officer hesitates, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He backs off, realizing the call was unjustified, and leaves. The neighbor, now embarrassed, retreats into his house. The family, though shaken, stands together. They've been made to feel unwelcome in their own home, but they've maintained their dignity. The incident sparks conversations in the neighborhood. Some begin questioning the neighbor's actions, realizing that racial biases had influenced his decision to call the police. In the days that follow, the family's courage becomes a symbol for standing up against racism. The neighbor, on the other hand, faces the consequences of his actions, as others start to see through his prejudice. The family emerges even stronger, united in their fight for respect and justice.